Namaste, namaste everyone. Namaste Pankaj ji, Dr. Pankaj Saxena. Namaste. We have a very special faculty today amongst us, Dr. Pankaj Saxena from the Rashram School of Public Leadership. He will be taking the course on Tirtha Yatra. A little bit about Pankaj ji. Dr. Pankaj Saxena is an author. He writes about arts, aesthetics, culture, literature, and Hindu temple architecture. He has visited more than 1,000 ancient Hindu temples and has studied many of them deeply. He's also deeply interested in cultural anthropology, evolutionary biology, and natural history. He has been writing articles, research papers, and reviews in online and print newspapers and magazines for the past few years, like India Facts, Swarajya, Indic Today, Surf News, etc. He currently works at Indic Academy Rashtram Center for Cultural Leadership at Sonipat, and he's an associate professor here. At the IA Rashtram Center for Cultural Leadership, he's engaged about research in culture and how traditional knowledge conveys itself through rituals, customs, and folk practices. He's also deeply engaged in research on the Hindu temple, Hindu aesthetics, and Hindu charity. Pankaj has deep interest in Hindu temple architecture, and it is his passion to bring all Hindu temples of architectural, cultural, and historical importance on the cultural tourist map of India. He wants to make the institution of the Hindu temple a more widely understood institution than it is today. He has authored two books related to the subject so far: Siddhagiri, the Mutt of Kaneri, a history of the Lingayat Mutt in Kolhapur, and Morena, an architectural wonder, which is an illustrated book about the architectural idioms of Hindu temples and Morena. Thank you so much, Pankaj. We are feeling really blessed, and thank you so much for joining this session. And over to you. Just one thing before you start the session, I would really request all participants to keep their videos on. I've attended a couple of sessions with Pankaj, and it's very nice to have an engaging conversation with them. So it'll be really nice if we can all keep our videos on, and also from the attendance perspective, right? So thank you, everyone. Over to you, Pankaj.
Thank you, Namrata, very much for the introduction and introducing the subject. Let me share my slide so we can start. Is it visible?
Yes, it is.
And is it changing?
No, it's on the first slide.
It's not changing?
No, it's on the first slide.
Okay, I think.
And full screen also.
Yeah, now it's changing. Yes, now it's changing.
So if I keep it like this, will it be okay? Is it visible?
Sure, it is.
Okay, so let me keep it like this in slideshow. I think there is some problem, so
okay,
it doesn't show change. Okay, so today's topic is Tirtha Yatra. I would let me give this caveat that I do not approach it from the point of view of a great scholar or the point of view of a great Shastri. Other speakers today are great carriers of the tradition, to whom I have nothing but a sense of deep and great respect and gratitude. I approach it from a different point of view. Like many in our age, I love travel. This age is given to travel. Many of us are fond of traveling. And this age has given us the means to travel and also to show the world that we are traveling, which in the past few years has become the more important segment of the travel, that we want to show that yes, we are traveling. But what is the intent and purpose of this travel? Is it a deeply Indic or dharmic thing? Is travel, if I put out the question like this straight forward, is travel a dharmic thing? Travel like this, travel without function, in the sense that travel without business or without an aim or goal of conquest, of other territory, is it okay to travel? Because there is a cost involved, not just in the terms of money, but in the terms of society, in which we have to leave one place, we have to go to another place, we change something in the society that we live, and we change something in the society that we visit, we change something in the societies that we pass through. So there is a cost of social relationships, and there is also an ecological cost, because obviously in this era we do not travel just on foot without leaving almost with zero imprint on the nature, on ecology. There is an ecological footprint of our travel. So is it a dharmic thing to do? Like everything else, Sanatana Dharma turned travel into a very dharmic adventure. So yatra is deeply sacred to us, but not any kind of yatra, not a yatra which is without purpose. Like everything else, in Sanatana Dharma, yatra also always has a purpose. It is never without meaning. Just like we never built empty kost or empty jharokas in our temples. If you go to a mosque, you will see jharokas which do not display anything. If you go to various modern pieces of architecture, there will be segments which are open to interpretation, in the sense that they do not display anything. But in Hindu architecture, you will never find that a coast always displays something, always has a meaning to carry. Similarly, yatra in Hindu cosmology always has a deeper meaning. It is aimed towards dharmic goal, and the ultimate goal, like everything else in Hindu cosmology, is moksha. And so yatra becomes tirth yatra when it becomes dharmic. For us, apart from the necessary travel, of course, like for business or for military conquest or for doing other necessary things, yatra has to be tirth yatra. Otherwise, it is not encouraged. So, but when it becomes tirth yatra, we see that it is everywhere. And we see this exhortation right from the very beginning. So before we delve a little deeper into that, let us see what are the dimensions of a yatra, because the word tirth yatra, of course, is made from tirth and yatra. So first, let us just have a very small, very brief, spatial understanding of yatra. What are the dimensions of a yatra? So one thing is certain, that a yatra has a center. There is a goal. There is a place, a very specific place which we are going towards. And there is a very specific place from which we are starting. So these two things are certain, that there is a center. There is a tirth, there is a kshetra, and there is a place from where you are starting. And then there is a border, a periphery. There is a great sense of sacred space, which is spread out evenly, but there is a sense of boundary, a sense of in and out. So there is a sacred sense of Bharatvarsh while we discuss Tirth Yatra. And there is, of course, when there is Yatra, there is always the road. There is a path in between. There is a path leading to the Tirth, and which is Yatra. What is the meaning of Tirth, meanwhile? There are various different interpretations, different meanings of Tirth, but the most common, which will be useful for our purpose today, and this is what I'm going to discuss. A Tirth is like a ford, a shallow place in a river. Literally, its literal meaning is shallow place in a river where you can cross it to go to the other side. And spiritually also, it means something on the similar lines. So Tirth is a ford in the sense that most of these Tirth are built on the banks of a river or a sacred lake or on the banks of an ocean. But it has to be approachable from the other side too, if it is built on the banks of a river. So that's otherwise only people from one side would be able to approach it. That's why where it is shallow, where it is easier to cross it. We have to remember that all of this system was created in a time where there were no iron bridges, no airlift, or no such modern convenience that we have today. So people would often visit a Tirth by crossing many rivers. And so it was built generally at places which were easier to cross. Spiritually also, it is a place which is more divine than other places in our samsara, where the presence of the gods is easier to decipher, is easier to access, where the gods are easier to access, where the divinity is more palpable, where various yogis, various meditators have for millions of years, for thousands of years have meditated there and made it with their tapas, made it a more a highly elevated place. So spiritually also, it is a place where we can find gods, deities, and which in Hindu cosmology, Hindu cosmological sense, where we can find the ultimate truth, where we can have self-realization more easily. And that's why it is called a tirth or a fort, where it is easier to reach the divine. This, I will not go deeply into our text, but one quotation, one verse from the Vedas themselves is imperative to read. Other than that, I will go on a different vein, but this quotation is very necessary, that the sense of in yatra has been inculcated in the Hindu psyche since a very, very long time. This is from Rig Veda itself. Flower-like are the heels of the wanderer. Thus his body grows and is fruitful. All his sins disappear, slain by the toil of his journey. There is no happiness for him who does not travel. Thus we have heard. Living in the society of men, the best of men becomes a sinner. Therefore, wander. The feet of the wanderer are like the flower. His soul is growing and reaping the fruit, and all his sins are destroyed by his fatigues and wandering. Therefore, wander. The fortunate of him who is sitting sits. It rises when he rises. It sleeps when he sleeps. It moves when he moves. Therefore, wander. So the Rig Veda itself commands us to travel. Travel with a sense of great, divine, sacred sense of purpose. It is not aimless. It is not without a center. It is not without a periphery. It is not without an intended direction, a path of travel. But travel we should, travel we must. This is conveyed through various ways. Because what happens, let us just withdraw from the Rig Veda for a moment and let us dwell on what happens when we go out of our homes. Today, travel has become very predictable because it has become very comfortable. You can book on Make My Trip and Booking.com hotels and places thousands of miles away, and previously months ago, and you can book tickets from 2 or 3 months ago. But this was not so always. But even today, there is a great sense of uncertainty to travel. A million different things can happen while you're traveling. Imagine that 100 years ago, when none of these certainties existed, and many of us are privy to that experience, that even 20 years ago, before the internet, travel was mostly very, very unpredictable. A lot of unpredictable things would happen. A lot of strange things would happen. Some of them would be dangerous, but all of them, if you survive them, all of them would teach you a lot about life, about journey, and about our existence. So when you leave the house, imagine a situation 100 years ago, you are leaving the house. While you're living in a house, Sanatan Dharma is all about creating certainties for the society to exist. So when the Dharma Shastras, which speak on how society should be managed, they speak about certainties. They speak about very concrete things. They speak about very fixed and definite identities, fixed and definite roles and duties. So there is no uncertainty in that, because while you're living at home, according to a traditional Hindu household, you get up at a certain time in the morning. You do your daily ablutions, you go take a bath, and then you offer some puja, you read some scripture, then you go on about your work. There is a certain rhythm to your entire day until you go to bed once again in the night. So the day while you are at home is full of certainties. These certainties are broken, of course, sometimes when something untoward happens, when some accident happens, when some relatives visit perhaps, unwanted people who are at your gates. But in whole, as a whole, the house is a very symbol of certainty and comfort and security. Not many things change here, and that is what gives you a sense of deep-ended, deep-rooted security, that you are safe here. Because change also implies something dangerous can come and into your routine, and so there is a great sense of loss of safety while you travel, while things change. But while you are at home, there is a great sense of comfort and security. So when you leave home, 100 years ago, when you leave home, all of these certainties collapse almost instantly. If you're 20, 30 kilometers away from your home, people are speaking a different language. The food has changed, the clothes have changed, the climate has changed. There is no home, of course, there is no certainty to where you will be asleep, where you will sleep in the night. There is no certainty to what you will eat or where you will live, where you will go to while you are on the journey. So all the constants of the life instantly collapse, and you are almost by design, you are led to ponder over what is that which is eternal, what is that which is always constant, what is that which never changes. Because until yesterday, everything which you considered eternal, perennial, or which has been existing since times immemorial, because 100 years ago, we would generally die in the house in which we were born. And so there was a great certainty to life. So everything which was certain, when all of that has collapsed, when all of the constants of life have collapsed, what is that which is eternal? And so on our yatra, when these constants collapse, we are forced to look for that eternal element. And that eternal element, the search for that eternal element is the search of self-realization, is the search for the ultimate truth. And that is the end of that is the goal, that is the end goal of a Tirth Yatra. That is what we are going to look for. So in the sense that the very agency of travel forces you to think over what is temporary and what is eternal. So a yatra, a Tirth Yatra especially, impels you in that direction. Now, so this creates a Tirth Yatra. There is a yatra and there is a Tirth, there is a center to which you are going to. Now, how do we create a sacred sense of space? Hindus had a great sense of space. Bharatvarsh had a great sense of space, but it was different from the sense of space that we have accustomed to talk to in modern times. So what was that sense of space? Let us start from something which is very different. There is this saying, this kahavat is very, very popular in India. Kan kan mein hai Bhagwan. We keep saying that the divine is everywhere, which is very, very true. But even then, when this sense is reinforced that every speck of the universe, of the cosmos, is full of the divine, the samsara, the cosmos, the universe, our little universe, is created with a gradient. Gradient in the sense that some spaces are considered more divine, more sacred than the others. And we are impelled to go to these sacred places, to travel to these sacred places. And that symbolic, that physical travel from our place, which is considered less sacred, to that place, which is considered more sacred, a gradient is created. The gradient is meant to elevate your consciousness from a lower level to a higher level. And so that is what a Tirth Yatra does to us. These sacred gradients are created everywhere and on every level in society. It is not generally that there is one sacred center. For example, there is no single Makkah or Jerusalem or Moscow in Hindu Dharma. There are various very important, very prominent Tirth and Kshetra in Bharatvarsh, which we are meant to go to, meant to visit. But that does not mean that they are the only ones. And no single Kshetra is said to be that it overshadows every other Tirtha Kshetra. So this sense of sacredness is created on many different levels, even inside a home. there is a sense of sacred and a sense of places which are less sacred. So there is a puja ghar, there is a mandir in every home, and it is considered more sacred than other spaces. We remove our shoes when we approach this, even if it is just a jharoka inside one room of our house. Many of the houses, many of us have lived in houses which are not big enough so that we could create a separate puja room. So in one room, there would be one jharoka, one almari, in which there would be a small temple. But around that temple, there would be great aura of the sacred, of the divine. While approaching that, you would not do things which you generally do while you are in your bedroom or while you are chatting with your friends. So there is a sense of, even inside your house, there is a sense of places which are more sacred, places which are less sacred. And apart from the puja ghar, another place which was considered extremely sacred was the kitchen, the rasoi. Every house had a perpetually burning fire. Now, let me tell you this, it is a wonderful thing which existed until just 40, 50 years ago in many of our homes. Before the LPG, before these induction cooktops, and before modern means of cooking, we all of us used some kind of chulha, and the fire in the chulha would always be lit. In the night, the embers would be kept burning, and in the morning, they would be stoked again so that food could be cooked. So, just like a Vedic Agni is always kept alive, this Agni in the kitchen, it was always kept alive. And because of the presence of this Agni, kitchen was one of the most sacred of spaces in our houses. That is why food in a Hindu universe is given that hallowed a ground, because it is built around fire, it is cooked around, it is cooked directly sometimes on fire, but around fire. So in some homes which were, let's say, 400 or 500 years old, literally the Agni would be burning continuously for 300-400 years. And that constant burning of the fire is one of the most prominent symbols of the presence of divinity and sacredness in any place. And so kitchen was given a very, very high place in our homes. And incidentally, it was called in Hindi and in various other languages also, rasoi. And the word comes from ras, where the ras emerges. If you read the Natya Shastra, if you read the ras theory, this ras is not just in Natya, in higher disciplines, it is also in food. So the ras that emerges in food is also equated to the ras that emerges in music, in dance, in sadhana, in meditation. So by this sacred common vocabulary, which is used in food as much as it is used in painting or architecture or sculpture or sacred scriptures and meditation, the same vocabulary is used interchangeably, so that a shared vocabulary is created and people can understand it freely across various disciplines. Incidentally, rasoi in Hindu homes would be built in almost the opposite direction of the lavatory or the toilet. Now in modern flats, they are often plopped right next to each other or very near to each other, in front of each other. But in traditional homes, at one corner would be the toilet and on another corner would be the kitchen. So this gradient between the sacred and the not so sacred, everything, let me say this, let me reiterate it here, that even while gradients are created in samsara of things and places more sacred, no place is considered completely non-sacred. No place is completely thrown out of the ambit of the divine and the sacred. But to encourage you to move towards greater places of higher places of consciousness, yes, this gradient is created. So it starts out from our home. Then within our village, within our town, there is a Gram Devta, there is a temple to the Gram Devta, and if not Gram Devta, then various other deities and gods that we worship. So in a society, there is a temple, so there are places more sacred. In a town, there are places more sacred. And this is created this is repeated on every level. This is Shanichra, one of the most sacred temples of Morena district of Madhya Pradesh. It is the sacred center of that district and a large area from all around. So every region has a great Tirth. And this formula this a sacred center, a sacred periphery, and a yatra is repeated on every level. Every district, if you would say, or every cultural region would have a most sacred tirth at its center. People from all over the cultural region or the catchment area, if you would, this sacred catchment area, if you would like the phraseology, would come to this place from the periphery to this place, and there would be yatra involved. In this yatra, there will be exchange of food, of culture, of cultural practices. There will be tolerance towards that which is different, but at the same time preserving that which is our own in food and culture and clothing. So there is a great mixing of cultures, not to the point where they become indistinguishable from each other. I think someone has opened his mic. There is some disturbance. I would request if you could mute the mic. Yeah. Thank you. So there is a great mixing of cultures, not to the point where they become indistinguishable from each other, but to the point where they develop respect and tolerance for another, or different sect, a different community, which is a different way of life in food and clothing. This formula is repeated all over Bharatvarsh, and a sacred sense, sacred space of Bharatvarsh is created. Now we will go, after discussing a little about what the Tirth Yatra is and what the vision of Tirth Yatra is, we'll go just a little over some of the most famous Tirtha Kshetra in India. There are some pictures that I will show you, and just the names. So we have an idea that how far and wide these Tirtha Kshetras are spread, and they are in every nook and corner of India. And after that, we'll discuss a few more things about the sacred Kshetra. So let us discuss at first Tirtha Kshetra, the sacred centers. Some of the most famous examples. This is Bradishwar temple in Thanjavur in Tamil Nadu, one of the greatest and the highest temples in ancient India. Now they are building higher temples in this, but for a very long time, this was the highest temple in Hindu temple anywhere. This is the Meenakshi Amman temple in Tamil Nadu. These gopurams are built or made higher in later ages, but the Kshetra, the temple, is very, very old. The Virupaksh temple in Pattadakal in Karnataka. The Veer Narayan temple by the great Hoysar dynasty in Karnataka in Chikmagalur district. It is a Trikut, the third temple. It cannot be seen in this shot. The Kedareshwar temple by the Chalukyas in Karnataka, in Balligaon, Shimoga district. In Andhra, there is a Tirumala Devasthanam. Ramappa temple in what is now Telangana. It is recently declared as the World Heritage Site. Incidentally, it's one of the very few Kakatiya monuments, Kakatiya temples, which were left alone because it was hidden in some remote place, so that it was not destroyed. So that is why it has survived very well. Otherwise, other Kakatiya temples were destroyed quite completely. The Anantapur temple in Kasaragod. This is the different Kerala style of architecture. What we saw before this were Dravid and Nagar style of temples. In the Kerala style of temple, the mandap is built separately from the garbhagriha in most of the cases. So there is a very beautiful element where you're across the mandap, in front of the garbhagriha, having darshan, and you are under the open sky. Kailashnath Ellora, this is one of the greatest wonders of, greatest creations of the Hindu temple architecture. It is a rock cut temple. Generally, a rock cut temple is considered prior in the stages of evolution to a structural temple. But this temple at Kailashnath Ellora is two-story, and everything, there are thousands of sculptures on its walls. Everything from freestanding pillars to other sculptures have been carved out from a single rock. It is a hill which they have carved out, and from which it is carved out. So it is one of the greatest wonders. Elephanta on the Kharapuri Island near Mumbai. It contains some of the most beautiful sculptures that were ever created by the Hindu sculptors. You can see a Sadashiv here and also the Ardhanarishwar. The sculpture that is shown in Elephanta is certainly one of the best creations of Hindu architecture and sculpture. Then we come to the Naga temples in the north. One of the best examples is Kandariya Mahadev in Khajuraho, Madhya Pradesh. Khajuraho has around 20 temples which are still left intact, but this is one of the best creations. One of the greatest sun temples to exist in ancient India, the Modhera Sun Temple in Gujarat. Unfortunately, most of the temple is destroyed. The Garbhagriha is no more. The Shikhar is no more. This is just what is left of the mandap and the beautiful Kalyani that is in front of the temple. It is one of the most well-articulated Kalyanis of all temples in India. There are various smaller temples that are built all across the four sides of the Kalyani at various levels. So it is one of the most wonderful creations when you come to these Baulis, vows, or the step wells, the sacred step wells of India. Ambika temple in Rajasthan, in Jagat, Rajasthan. This is one of the few temples in Rajasthan which got saved from the fury of the invaders, and thus it is almost intact. You can see the development of the Nagri Shekri style here quite well, and all of the sculpture is almost intact. It is one of the greatest wonders that are still around. Uttar Pradesh was the center of our civilization in various ways, but due to massive destruction in the medieval era, not much is left here. But here is one temple in Bhitargaon near Kanpur. This is in Bhuramdev, Chhattisgarh. It is called the Khajuraho of Chhattisgarh. This is built in Bhumij style of the Nagar, Bhumij sub-idiom of the Nagar style. And it is in one of the remote areas of Chhattisgarh, but it also survives almost unscathed without being destroyed. I'm giving you an idea of how these temples are everywhere in every state of India. When I was growing up, what happened in North India is that because most of these temples were destroyed many times over, so the Garbhagritas were no more, or they were so thoroughly destroyed that people abandoned them and created new temples. So in North India, and even though I come from Gwalior, around which there are various great ruins of great temples, the working temples were the new temples. So I had a sense that in North India, not much has survived. But if you go to most of the states of India, the ruins, at least the great signs of Hindu architecture are still there. In Bihar, there is a very famous now Mundeshwari Devi temple. Jharkhand is a great place, but sadly here most of the ancient structures are also destroyed. But here there is one recreated one in Badrinath, Jharkhand. In Bengal also there was great destruction, but after the destruction, a new style emerged, which is the terracotta, which are called the terracotta temples of Bengal. Because of the use of terracotta, the scenes from the epics, from the Mahabharata, from the Ramayana, are depicted again and again and very beautifully on these temples, for which they are very famous. Sun Temple, Konark in Odisha. If those who do not know, this is just the mandapam, the Jagmohan in the Odishan style of architecture of the great Sun Temple. The temple was much bigger and much higher, but the Shikhar has already collapsed a few centuries ago. So now only the Jagmohan or the mandapam survives. This is another different style of the hilly states in Himachal, where due to heavy rainfall and snowfall, this pagoda style of architecture prevails, which is more resistant to piling up of snow and also natural calamities such as earthquakes. But there are also stone temples in great places in these hills, and the Kedarnath temple is one of the greatest examples of this. Kashmir, which is now known for very different reasons, was a great center of Hindu Dharma. Kashmir Shaivism, one of the greatest philosophical traditions of Bharatvarsh, of Agamic tradition. It was born here. And you can still see the ruins of many great temples. Even in places as far off as Tripura, you get to see various rock-cut temples and rock-cut creations of the Hindu society. So the point here is that these tirthas are everywhere. There is no place in India, no great place in India, which is left untouched with this sacralization of Hindu sacred space of Bharatvarsh. Every place is divine. Every place has a sacred center. Whole land is sanctified by this process, and we'll see how. These tirthas are everywhere in greatest of cities like Ujjain, the Mahakal temple in Ujjain. In the smallest of villages, Somnathpur today is a very small village in the Mysore district, very far off from great cities, but it sports one of the greatest temples that the Hoysalas ever built. And in the farthest of corners, this temple is in Bharmor, in Chamba district, Himachal Pradesh. The mountain ranges overladen with the snow that you see behind is the Mani Mahesh Kailash range. This mountain range has never been climbed. It has never been crossed. After this place, Bharmor, if you go from Chamba, if you try to reach Bharmor, it will take you around 4 hours through modern roads, which is the distance is just 60 kilometers or so. But even then it will take you 4 hours or so because the path is so, the road that leads to Bharmor is so risky and so hard, so tough. After a few 4 or 5 kilometers from Bharmor, the road itself stops. It is one of the last stops. After that, you have to go on foot on the Mani Mahesh Kailash track, on Mani Mahesh Kailash Jatra, which is held every year. When people from all over Chamba and Himachal Pradesh, they proceed from every small temple on a yatra and they come to Bharmor, to the Mani Mahesh lake, from where they have darshan of Mani Mahesh Kailash. So this whole region is bound in that sacred geography. And you are amazed by how far-sighted our ancestors were, that they created an imprint of our civilization in one of these farthest of corners. If you reach Bharmor, it is difficult to reach there. It is difficult to take anything, any article of use to this place. And while you are on, while you're traveling to Bharmor, you think that there is almost nothing beyond, because who can live in such a harsh place? But then suddenly on a tabletop mountain, just a little jutting out of a mountain, you find 84 temples on a single platform. It is called Chaurasi temple because there are 84 temples on a single platform. Many of them are small, but many of them are also very big. This is one of the largest and the biggest temple, the Mani Mahesh temple of Bharmor. So our ancestors made it sure that even the remotest of corners of Bharatvarsh, even the remotest of corners were completely imprinted with the seal of the divine. And that's why all of these holy centers were created. Excuse me for 1 minute, I will have a sip of water. I would request once again, please, to switch off your mic if you have accidentally started it. Yeah. So, what are the borders? This exercise of sacralizing the land of Bharatvarsh, it obviously has a sense of in and out, in the sense not that anything which is outside Bharatvarsh is a bad place or a place which should not be visited or where evil people live. But the whole land of Bharatvarsh is considered more sacred because of its peculiar history, its peculiar geography, because so many great saints have been born in this sacred land, have done tapas, and have created great scriptures, great Tirtha Kshetras. So this land is considered very sacred, and this sacred sense of sacred boundary is created in the minds of all Hindus. For example, geography, looking at maps and having a great sense of geography is a modern, you can say, aptitude, which was not there when there were not great maps. There were great maps, but they were handmade. They were a privilege of very few. And obviously, those who did not need it, most of the society at that time, 99.99% of the people, they did not have a very physical map of these places in his mind. Still, if you talk to a common man, if you go to, let's say, Sabji Mandi, and if you go to a Sabji Wala and ask him about the idea of, about the map of Bharatvarsh, modern India, then he might falter, although he's seen it many times now. So the consciousness is greater. But at the same time, if you ask him about the Tirthas of India, then through these Tirthas, he will have a very clear map of India. He will be able to tell you where are the Char Dhams. He will be able to tell you where are the Jyotirlingas. He will be able to tell you where are the Shakti Pithas. And incidentally, all of these places create, if you map them roughly, they cover all parts of India and create the boundaries of India. And even after many partitions, not just the one in 1947, we find that most of these places, all Char Dhams are still in the modern current boundaries of India. All the Jyotirlingas are still within the current boundaries of India, and an overwhelming majority of the Shakti Pithas are also inside the current boundaries of India, with a few lying in Pakistan and Bangladesh, what are now Pakistan and Bangladesh. So here are the four dhams, roughly covering the four great corners of India: north, south, east, and west. When you see the map of Jyotirling, you also see that they cover various different parts of India and miss almost nothing. East, west, north, south, they are everywhere. And the map of Shakti Pithas, even Adi Shakti Pith are 18, but then other Shakti Pith are 51 and 54 due to various, according to various counts. And they cover almost every single part of India, not just this India, but the undivided India, which would include Nepal, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. So a sacred sense of boundary is created. A sacred arena is created, and this idea is repeated at many levels. For example, in Maharashtra, you have this concept of Ashtavinayak. So there is a sacred region in which the temples of Vinayak, temples of Ganpati are there, and you are impelled to go to all of these places. If you have been to one of these Vinayak temples, then they will exhort you, the people there will exhort you, and you will be exhorted, because they are just the existence of the figure Ashtavinayak will tell you that I have been to two, so I should now go to the other six. Similar thing works with the Char Dham and various other Jyotirlings and various other places in India, that if you've gone to one, then you have to visit another. There are various legends connected to each other. For example, if you are at Badrinath, you are encouraged to take Ganga Jal from the river that flows on which the teeth of Dham of Badrinath lies. And then you are encouraged to offer it to the Shivling in Rameshwara. So you have to do the full circuit. If you are starting from Puri, or if you are starting from Badrinath, then you have to go to the other dhams, and that is how you should do your yatras. Similarly, the legends of the Jyotirlings are connected. There is, of course, a legend of the great goddess and how the different Shakti Pithas are created. If you are at one place, you will be worshipping the eyes of the goddess. At other place, the other body part of the goddess. And so you are impelled to go from one to another in order to have a full, complete experience. So along with the sacred elevation of your consciousness, there is also this social, cultural dimension in which people are encouraged to come together to know each other without having to change your own core culture of food, clothing, and housing. So you are encouraged to tolerate others. It is said, even though there were various jatis and varnas in India, it is said that in Jatra this was very common. There are no jatis in Jatra. So you will find that those people who are very, very particular about where to eat, with whom to sit, where to marry your sons and daughters. On a jatra, they will not at all care about these things, and they will freely sit and eat with other people who are from very different jatis and very different varnas. So that's why it is called that on a jatra, there is no jati, because these distinctions are very important while the sansara exists. But while you are on a jatra, to a sacred center, to a tirth, you are on a very spiritual journey. You are about to, you are transcending these discriminations, these distinctions, these differences. And so on a jatra, you start out by eliminating all of that. This is very visible in case of the Sabrimala Yatra too. Everyone is a Swami, everyone is addressed as a Swami. There is no other appellation. Everyone is the great God himself. And so there is no distinction. There is no question of any distinction like this. So this is how Sanatana Dharma maintained the distinction in samsara where they are necessary, but also impelled its citizens, its followers at the same time to transcend these distinctions, these differences, these divisions, so that we can approach the ultimate truth, whereas there is no division of the devotee and the deity himself, of the subject and the object itself. So this is how these sacred circuits were created. So just like Ashtavinayak in Maharashtra, there is a great Marathi consciousness when you talk about these Ashtavinayak. And then there are the different circuits in different states and cultural regions. So for example, there is the concept of Pancha Mahabhuta Sthalam, which four of them which are in Tamil Nadu, one in at the just across the border from Tamil Nadu in Andhra Pradesh. So you visit that great cultural region. If you visit all those five great temples, then there are Divyadeshams in which all the great temples of Vishnu are there. Most of them are in south, but whole of India is actually covered also in this idea of Divyadesham. Then there are 5 temples of Murugan Swami. And there are different such appellations, different cultural regions are bound together in these different combinations of the tirtha, of kshetras, just like this picture which shows the Ashtavinayak in Maharashtra. So these are the sacred centers, or the, where we discuss the borders, how the borders of Bharatvarsha are created. As far as these sacred kshetra lie, the reign of Bharatvarsh continues. But then there are roads, the sacred roads, which connect the individuals and the communities to these places. These yatra, Kumbh Mela is one of the most famous of these yatras. It is a Mela, but we all take a journey to reach there. Dhams are located. Kumbh Mela are in many cases the opposite of dhams. Dhams are located at 4 corners of India, generally very far away, sometimes inaccessible corners, where a devotee has to go to the saints or the guru to gain self-realization, to go on the path of ultimate truth. But at Kumbh Mela, something opposite happens. First of all, it is not in a very harsh place. It is not in a mountainous place or at an ocean side. It is on a very, very easily accessible place where everyone can gather, where huge gatherings can take place. And very importantly, at Kumbh Melas, sadhus gather, saints gather at one place. So here, saints come to meet the devotee, gurus come to meet the devotee or their disciples. So this is a yatra which is one of the most defining incidents, events that define Bharatvarsh or Sanatana Dharma. Dhams, where devotees trek, as we discussed. Then Kavad Yatras. Actually, if you map entire India, at any time you will see that various of these yatras are going on. Sometimes Kavad Yatras are going. Kavad Yatra is a concept where you take, the same concept is there, where you take water from one place and you offer to Shivling at another place. And in between, you travel through various of the places, you visit various of the tirthas in between, various places in between. And not just Kavod Yatras, but various such yatras are taking place all the time. If you map India according to this, you will see that it comes alive. Every little city, every little town is full of these yatras. Every little district has many of these sacred centers, sacred yatras, and sacred circuits where people are constantly going from one place to another. And most of these yatris leave almost zero ecological footprint on nature. First of all, they exert themselves too much. The yatra, the aim of a tirth yatra is that you cleanse your mind and body of things which are sansaric. So, like we started from where we started this lecture, that when you go out of the house, the constants collapse, and you have to constantly struggle to keep yourself afloat, to keep alive, to keep eating and sleeping and living, so that you can reach your goal, reach the tirth. And in the process, your body is cleansed of all the vikaras, and then your mind is also cleansed. Mind is cleansed of the distinction that sansar embeds in us, of the sense of being different, the sense of being many, which is considered ignorance or the opposite of knowledge in Hindu cosmology. The sense that I am different, that I am a particular being, that I am a man, I am an Indian, I am a human being, I am living here. This sense of being distinct from the divine, from the ultimate truth, from the supreme consciousness is considered ignorance. And so these impurities which seep on into your mind while you're living in samsara, if you go on a tirth yatra, if you go through the hardships of a tirth yatra, like a traditional tirth yatra is supposed to, first your body is cleansed of its vikaras, and then your mind is cleansed of its vikaras. So then when you finally present yourself in front of the deity, in the Garbhagriha, in the Tirth Kshetra, you're able to see the ultimate truth. Or at least this is the design of the whole edifice. You are impelled to do so. Mani Mahesh Yatra, as we discussed, it is one of the most sacred circuits of Himachal Pradesh. People all over from Himachal Pradesh go to Chamba for this Mani Mahesh Yatra. It is the sacred point, highest sacred point of their lives. People from all over India visit Himachal. And you must be wondering that why is this called Mani Mahesh Kailash? That Kailash is now lies in Tibet, outside the boundaries of India. So yes, the great Kailash lies outside the boundaries of India. But India also has a sense of recreating the sacred geography. So there are various Kailashas in the Himalayan mountain range, not just one. And if you ask the locals, for them it is not the secondary Kailash. For them there is no original and the secondary Kailashas. For them, every Kailash is their Kailash. If you ask them, if you put this question to them like a modern educated historian would, then they will scoff at you, laugh at you, that what is the sense? What is the way in which you are asking this question? Of course, this is the Kailash, and this is the reverence with which they approach the Kailash. There is a very great folk song in Himachal, which says that Kasoli ni basna, Shimle ni basna, Kasoli ni basna, Chambe jana zarur. And so the importance of Chamba and Mani Mahesh is the foremost and the highest in the imagination of the Pahadi communities of Himachal Pradesh and also of the neighboring states. And this yatra attracts Mani Mahesh Lake and the mountain. It attracts pilgrimages, jatras from every corner of the Chamba district and also other districts of Himachal. So at least in Chamba district, every temple has a great festival. They start out, they take a palki, they take the Utsav Murti of the main deity in their temple, and by taking the palki of the deity, they go on foot around sometimes even 60 to 65 kilometers on foot in mountainous region. So they can go to this lake and have darshan of the sacred Mani Mahesh Kailash. Various other festivities take place during this festival. Every little place has some legend which is associated with the great legend of how Mani Mahesh Kailash, how Shiv came to reside in Mani Mahesh Kailash and near the temple where it is situated. So the story is very meaningful in the sense that it binds all of geography like a garland binds all the constituent pearls or the flowers. Every place, every temple has a place in the sacred legend of Mani Mahesh, a distinct place in the legend of Mani Mahesh. And this is how all of these yatras are organized. Similarly, there are pradakshanas, uh, parikramas of sacred mountains. One such sacred hill is the Arunachala hill in Tiruvannamalai. The whole hill is considered a Shivling. It is called one of the Panch Mahabhuta Sthalam of Dakshin Bharat, and it is considered an Agni Kshetra because it is very hot. The legend of where Lord Shiv manifested as a shaft of light is associated particularly with this place. The Arunachala hill is that shaft of light, is the Shivling. And so people do a pradakshina of this sacred hill. It is called Girivalam, and it can be offered anytime, but the festival which Kartik Deepam, which just passed a few days ago, it is the greatest night on which you can take a pradakshina of this sacred Arunachala hill. So there are various mountains around which we go around, just like the Mani Mahesh Kailash. Then rivers too have their own pradakshina. People take yatra of Narmada. They go around a mountain. They go around various dhams. So they go around Bharatvarsh. They go around various Jyotirlingas, various Shaktipithas. So the very body of the great goddess, the very concept of Shiva, but also around the rivers. So in Narmada and various other rivers, but in Narmada most prominently, people take a yatra where they go through all of these places which are mentioned on this map and many more. So to make a complete round of Narmada, because it is possible in the case of Narmada that you do a round of, go around Amarkantak, then you go to somewhere near Surat, and you can go around the river and do a complete pradakshina of the river. So it's a wonderful thing that this can be done with a river, and a river which is most sacred. In various of the legends, the Narmada is called to be even older and more sacred than the Ganga. So this sacred yatra of sacred pradakshina of a river also takes place. So you see, in Hindu cosmology, everything is sacred. A river is not just water, a conduit of water. I remember watching a movie, a very sleazy scene in a very popular movie, where it is said, the hero is saying that the water of the Godavari is not so that it goes to waste by meeting the ocean. We have to harvest it. We have to make dams and use all of the water for the farmers that live around it. This is a sentiment with which a modern society approaches our natural resources, our nature, our prakriti, that they are resources to be used. A river is meant to meet the ocean. That's why Sangam are one of the most sacred pilgrimage sites in Hindu society, in Hindu cosmology. When two rivers meet, when a river meets the ocean, it is one of the most sacred places, because that is the meeting of the individual to the cosmic, with the cosmic, meeting of the individual and the universe, meeting of the particular individual consciousness with the supreme consciousness. It is a sign of that. And today, and that's why they are revered so much. And today we do not even let the rivers meet the ocean. If you go to various of these rivers where they meet the ocean, it is a sorry trickle. In the west, the great river of Colorado, which is a raging torrent, it no longer reaches the ocean at all. Every ounce of water that is produced in the river Colorado, it is used up by human beings elsewhere. It is stored in dams and reservoirs for human purpose. So this is not a Hindu sense of a space. I'm not saying that dams should not be built at all. We have built dams in ancient India too, but all the while keeping in view that a river is meant to meet the ocean. And then if it is not doing so because of human greed, then we have to control human greed and not the river itself. This is the sense with which we worship our nature, worship rivers and mountains, worship Prakriti. And that is, I hope that by rekindling this sense of Tirth Yatra, we also rekindle this sense of respect for the sacred. This is how the sacred geography is created. I'm nearing towards the end. Creating sacred geography, myths and legends are anchored in real geography. This is a shot of Chitrakoot where Mandakini River flows. If you go to this place, Chitrakoot, nothing old survives, nothing ancient survives. Chitrakoot has been destroyed many times. And so all of the temples that exist today are very modern temples, not going beyond the British era. Actually, various of the temples have plaster of Paris vigrahas. So many of the South Indians at least would be appalled at seeing these vigrahas, plaster of Paris murtis in various of these temples. But if you go around the geography, if you go around Chitrakoot, you will feel the presence of the divine, presence of the legend of Ram almost everywhere. It is because the geography itself is imprinted with the sacred legends, with sacred cosmology. Our geography is thus sanctified with legends. So if you read the Ramayana, you will encounter real places, places like Ayodhya, places like Kishkindha, places like Sri Lanka. So they are real places. And this does not mean that they are confined to a single Ramayana circuit. There are various places, various claimants to the same legend. For example, where Ram met Shabri, and Shabri offered those tasted berries. Actually, various places have that claim, not just one place, various places have that claim. And a Hindu psyche is not uncomfortable with accommodating all of them into the same legend. We are not discomforted by the thought that how can it happen in Gujarat? It is out of the way, or it should be somewhere else. We are not obsessed by creating one single true story. We are comfortable with accommodating various different legends, various repetition of the sacred geography, because we believe in, we have a sense of sacralization of all of our geography with this. So this sacred geography is created and sanctified with legends. Now, this is repeated at many times over. For example, Kashi, which is now Varanasi, the sacred center of Varanasi, Kashi. Kanchipuram in Tamil Nadu is actually built on, the word itself is Kashi. It is meant to be modeled on the city of Kashi. So Kashi becomes Kanchipuram. Similarly, Madurai, Mathura becomes Madurai. And there are various Ayodhyas. The capital of Thailand until a few decades ago, one or so centuries ago, was Ayutthaya. It is still a World Heritage Center. So there are many Ayodhyas, many Mathuras, many Kashis. This is how geography is sanctified. And the circle expands. There is Shyam on the name of Lord Krishna. There is Brahma on the name of Lord Brahma. There is the capital of Brunei is Bandar Shri Bhagwan, which is of course Hanuman. Although it is an Islamic country now, but the place name is still shows us that it was Hindu once. Mekong is nothing. This great river of beautiful river of Mekong is Ma Ganga. It is literally Ma Ganga. It is a branch of Ma Ganga in their local language, which becomes Mekong. This sacred geography is then repeated at many levels. There, every district will have a concept. Every little region will have a concept of Char Dhams. There are the Char Dhams of Badrinath, Dwarka, Puri, and Rameshwaram, but then there are Char Dhams of Uttarakhand itself, Gangotri, Yamunotri, Kedarnath, and Badrinath. Then in various other regions, there are this concept is repeated. For example, the district of Morena itself has Char Dhams, and they are the representative, and in the residents of Morena, they have utmost importance. Every river is Ganga. Kaveri is the Ganga of the south. Godavari is Ganga of the south. And actually, you can find it in the lingo of the people who live there. They do not say they are. जब अस्थि विसर्जन होता है, when they offer the ashes to the river, they do not say they are going to do it to a local river, or they do not take their name. They say हम गंगा में बहा कर आए, and for which they know that where they have gone to, they know that they have gone to the local river. But even then, the sense that they exude is that they have that every river is that sacred, that every river is Ganga, every mountain is Kailash, and every yatra is a pradakshina of cosmos. This is very important. Sanatana Dharma is very peculiar in this. It creates all sorts of rules, great elaborate sets of rules, and at the same time also gives you a key to break all these rules when they become immaterial. So there is a very famous story of Ganesh and Kartikeya. We are all familiar with it, that there was a bet that who can go faster around the cosmos, who can do 108 circles of the cosmos of the entire universe. Now Kartikeya, being very agile, handsome, and with a very fast vehicle, he immediately sets upon, because he is a very active god, and he goes around the universe. Now Ganesh, we see he has a mouse as his vehicle. He's also not very agile. He's also not very slim or very given to athletic pursuits. And so what does he do? He goes around his parents 108 times. And he says that his parents are everything to him, and they are the cosmos to him. So to someone who imbibes this sense so deeply that it becomes a living reality for him, these rules do not matter. So you are exerted, you are called upon to do all of these Tirth Yatras all the time. But at the same time, if you cannot do so, if you have bhakti inside your own home, inside your own village and town, then that is good enough for you. Not everyone goes to all of these four dhams. Not everyone goes to all of these Kumbh Melas. We are exhorted to, yes, but that is not, if you do not do it, it is not a crime. And you can be as sacred in your own place as you can be at different of these tirthas. There is a sense in which Pradakshina and Kshetram are connected. Hindu temple is a representation of the entire cosmos. If you go to various ancient temples which are still intact, you can see that the outermost walls are depicted with all sorts of scenes from common life, from samsara. So there are scenes of war, of great violence. There are erotic scenes. There are very mundane scenes, like somebody is doing some household chore, or somebody is just doing some makeup. And these mundane things are also depicted. As you go inside, these scenes become less in number. You get to see more deities, subsidiary deities. As you go in the Garbhagriha, as you proceed towards the Garbhagriha, everything else disappears. It is only the deity. There is no other deity also. So in this sense, a Hindu temple is considered to be a representation of samsara, of entire cosmos. It has to contain everything. That is the reason why erotica also exists in various of Hindu temples. It is not just in Khajuraho or Konark, it exists in hundreds and hundreds of temples in India. A temple which has a Pradakshina path inside it, it is called a Sandhar temple, which is incorporated within the architecture. Otherwise, you can always go around a temple in a Pradakshina. This Galganath temple, it is a Sandhar temple. This is the Chaunsat Yogini circular temple in Morena. It is a temple dedicated to the Tantric sect of Chaunsat Yogini. And in this, a Pradakshina path is open to the sky and all around the central shrine. So Pradakshina is an integral part of the temple, because as the temple is representation of the entire cosmos, by taking the Pradakshina, by taking this Sankalp, it is meant, it is considered that you have gone around the entire cosmos, you have gone around the entire universe, you have understood the entire story of life, of the existence. If you do it properly, this is the impact that the act of Pradakshina will have on your consciousness. In Kerala temple, as we discussed earlier, you can see open Pradakshina path. And in another of this imagination, self is the center and cosmos is the periphery. So the sansar is all around us. While we go on a Tirth Yatra, we witness sansar all around. But there is a journey of self towards the greater self. So while you sit down to meditate under the guidance of a great guru, you are this particular being. You are this particular person who are born in this life. But if you proceed on the path of meditation and if you reach the highest stages, gradually these various bounds of distinction, you lose them and you become one with the Supreme Consciousness. That's the goal of every meditational practice. In a Tirth Yatra also, this is the same sense, that you proceed from the individual self. While you leave your house, you are this Pankaj Saxena, this particular man, individual. But while you go on the Tirth Yatra, you lose these distinctions, these identities imposed on you by samsara and by your own karma, by your own previous lives. And while you reach the Tirth, the destination of your Tirth Yatra, and while you stand in front of the Garbhagriha, you see your own self, but the highest self, not the self that is this particular individual, but the highest self, which is the representation of the Supreme Consciousness. And if you're able to elevate your consciousness to that level, then you are having your own darshan while you stand in front of the Garbhagriha. That is the highest meaning of Tirth Yatra. That is the highest goal of Tirth Yatra. So in this way, darshan of the divine is also darshan of the self. It is the process of this path towards the ultimate truth. Sansar is what we observe in between while meeting our true selves. All around when we do this pradakshina, we go around this cosmos, we see the entire samsara and we enjoy it. We do not reject it like other sects. We do not abhor it. We do not detest it. It is not to be detested. It is not to be hated. It is to be enjoyed, but to be transcended at the same time. When there is no center, there is no self to look from. If you do not have any idea where you're looking from, this is as true about a secular sense of space as about other. If you do not have a point of view from where you're looking from, there is no self to look from. And there is no idea what you're making of your world, what you're looking at. And when there is no periphery, there is no sansar to look at. When there is no border, there is no sansar to look at. Both of these are necessary. Both of these are necessary in a Tirth Yatra. The journey is from self to self, but the journey is full of pleasure. It is not insipid. It is not full of frustration. It is full of enjoyment of the samsara, but it is a journey of self to self. Sanatan Dharma creates a sense of space, but like all things Sanatan, it also transcends it at the same time. So you are given a sacred sense of space. A gradient is created inside your house, in your village, in your town, inside your country, outside your country. But while you practice this sacred gradient, you are meant to transcend it. All these distinctions are meant to disappear. You are meant to meet the ultimate truth. A secular sense of space will also give us pain, but a sacred sense of space leads to Brahmana. When you achieve this, it leads to the highest pleasure that is considered in a Hindu sense of space, Hindu cosmology. That, in my view, is Tirth Yatra. Thank you. Thank you. I think I may not have exceeded the time that was given to me, but forgive me if I did. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pankaj-ji. I think it was a delightful session. It was almost like we were all doing the yatra ourselves as you were taking us through so many places and temples. Thank you so much. It was very delightful and very enriching for all of us.
Thank you, no problem.
Just wanted to understand if you have some time to take some questions from participants.
Yes, we can take 2 or 3 questions, of course.
Sure. Okay. If participants could just raise their hands, or if we could type in their questions, it will be great. We have about 15 minutes. Yes, Dr. Ajay ji, if you could unmute yourself.
Namaste, Pankaj ji.
Namaste ji.
Thank you for very much journey for the entire India, including Bara Jyotirling, Ashwinayak and everywhere. So it was a nice trip, Char Dham also.
Yeah.
And you just informed us about how our consciousness to be when we are going to the Dham or any yatra.
Yeah.
And just I want to know, like there are many temples or in some surprising observations were there, like in Ujjain. When we see that there are Kal Bhairav is there, who used to have that prasad, different prasad, or in other different temples we are having different, like in Rameshwaram we are having the say कुंड का स्नान होता है रामेश्वरम में. These are very special and say auspicious things in our. So how much they are important for us to visit there, means how we can correlate our consciousness with that.
Like the individual consciousness of a person, every tirth also has a distinct identity. A distinct identity in the sense that many tirthas are famous, many kshetras are famous for absolving their devotees of a certain vice, of a certain pain that they have encountered in life. So they are famous for that. For example, while you're doing Girivalam in Arunachala Hill, there are various temples, various tirthas on the sacred boundary, on the sacred periphery. Many of them deal with various different aspects of problems that we all encounter. Like many of us are claustrophobic, and it is said that this is because of trauma that we have at birth, because we pass through a very narrow canal. And so many of us have that sense of being suffocated. Whenever we are in a very close space, we feel suffocated. So you are meant to go through a very narrow tunnel in one of these tirth. And there are various tirthas all along India. And you are supposed to come out of, by doing that ritual, by doing that kriya, you are supposed to get absolved of that. So different of these tirthas have different characters. And they are famous, more famous for different things. So along with the ultimate goal, see, Sanatana Dharma is very practical also. The ultimate goal is always moksha, yes.
Yes.
So of every tirtha, the goal is the same. But at the same time, there are various sansaric problems too, which have to be encountered and overcome. And so various of the tirthas are famous for different things. So suppose if you're not having kids, if you cannot have children, or if you have other difficulty in your life, then different tirthas, different places are famous for different things. So that is the character of, they also acquire a very sansaric utility too, because they are also social institution, not just a spiritual institution. It is a first and foremost goal of a tirtha. It is for, you go to a temple to have darshan of the divine, of the highest self. But along with that, there are various things that you do while you are on a pilgrimage, and different tirthas have different characters. And we should go with full shraddha, like the Bhairav temple in Ujjain. Bhairav is the ugra aspect of Shiva, and which is not bound to any rules. It is not Saumya, it is not Satvik. And that is an aspect of nature that we worship everything that exists in this Prakriti. That's why with Lakshmi, there is always a Lakshmi. There is always an Ullu, an owl that we worship. A Western mindset would be very bewildered. Why is that so? Why do you also worship that? But that also exists in nature. So different tirthas have different characters, and we should approach with these different tirthas with that particular Shraddha.
I think because of that only there are many do's and don'ts in tirtha. Whenever we are going for tirtha, it is suggested that you do this and you avoid.
A deity is also an individual. It has also likes and dislikes, certain characteristics, and that is why in Sabrimala, women of a particular age are not allowed to visit, and in other temples only they are meant to visit. So different deities have different these individual characteristics.
Yeah, Pankaj, I have been in Gwalior for 3 years in Gwalior University in pharmacy college or in pharmacy department, and during that period I visited Pitambara and Ram Raja temple and others. So they are very nice. Ultimate one. Yes.
Thank you.
And whether you have visited or not in Mayapur, at birthplace of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu,
Yeah.
The TOVP, Temple of Vedic Planetarium, is under construction. So it is to be started in some way next month, next year or so.
Yeah.
So that temple is there. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Swati, would you like to go ahead?
Pranam sir, my question is about Shakti Peeth. You have mentioned about Adi Shakti Peeth and Mahashakti Peeth. I want to know the difference between Adi Shakti Peeth and Mahashakti Peeth.
Adi Shakti Peeth are also called as Mahashakti Peeth there, but then there is a distinction called 54 or 51. So there are different counts and numbers. That is also another way of our saints and rishis telling us that while there is a sacred number, there is a meaning to every this grouping 7, 5, 3. It doesn't mean that only that can be sacred. For example, there are 4 Vedas, but then there is a floating concept of 5th Veda. So Ayurveda is 5th Veda, Natya Shastra is 5th Veda, Mahabharata is 5th Veda. It is not like they declared a 5th Veda, then the position opened up for 6th Veda. By that, they are trying to convey that although the Vedas are meant to contain everything of ultimate knowledge, it is also possible to gain knowledge outside them too. So there is a concept of 5th Veda. So while we go on about Shakti Peeth, there are different counts. So 18 is the great number. So for Jwalaji in Kangra comes in one of those 18 Peeth. But then there are various other, like the Chintapurni temple in Una and various other places. They are counted among the other larger number of 51 or 54 Shakti. So there is no technical difference between them. Just a different count. Just a different count.
How many total number of Shakti Peeths, sir?
That's why there are different counts. Some say 54, some say 51. In 54, all of the 18 will also be there. In 51, all of the 18 Adi Shakti Peeth will also be there. But according to different count, there are 54, 51. And some say there is one in Afghanistan too, on which not everyone agrees. But the locals believe that yes, the few locals which used to live there, now they are in Pakistan and other places. They believe that one Shakti Peeth is also in Afghanistan.
Thank you.
Dr. Ashima, would you like to go ahead?
Pranam sir.
Yeah.
Actually, this session was really overwhelming for me. It was excellent exposition on Tirtha Yatra, and I felt as if here itself I did this Tirtha Yatra psychologically, mentally, and it just touched my all senses, and it really took me to that level, as if it really lets us to lead to moksha. So I just want to ask you that does one really get moksha if one completes Chardham Yatra?
If you have complete Shraddha, if you are able to undertake Tirth Yatra as one is meant to be, then obviously you will have moksha if you do these 4 dhams. So keep that Shraddha in mind. It might not be, I am not, of course, a Jivan Mukta. Otherwise, I would not be here. So I'm not a Jivan Mukta. I haven't got moksha, obviously. That part is certain. But our scriptures say so. And if you take that attitude towards these 4 dhams, then sooner or later it will of course happen. I have been to the 4 dhams, so it is not like there is a charya to do a Tirth Yatra. There is a lifestyle that is associated with it. There are certain things that you have to do with it. So if you do that, then if not instantly, then over the time that will happen. Our job is to do what is meant for us to do. Then the moksha part will happen. We don't have to worry about that.
Once again, my heartfelt gratitude to you.
Thank you.
The way you explained this Tirtha Yatra. Thank you so much, Pranam.
Thank you. Thank you. Gratitude.
We'll take one last question from Kayalviri ji. You want to go ahead, Kaivaliji ji?
Yes. So it was an excellent insight into the yatras. And I just want to know if there is a link between Jyotish Shastra and Tirtha Yatra, and many Jyotish Shastras linked with different Tirthas. Is it right? I just wanted to know about it.
Yeah, the link is there, and that is how our scriptures and our society actually exhort us to take the Tirth Yatra. So, for suppose if you are suffering from a particular ailment, from particular illness, physical or otherwise, if you are encountering a particular problem, then you are supposed to go to a particular place, to a particular temple, to offer a certain kind of ritual, to offer a certain kind of puja. So Jyotish is, of course, inextricably intertwined with Tirth Yatra. It is there in our geography. For suppose I was just the last month I was there in Kukke Subramanian temple. It is very famous for certain very definite pujas that you have to offer there. Similarly, the Mahakal temple in Ujjain and various other temples all over India. Most of the temples will have some puja to offer. Different temples are famous for different absolution of different problems, and that is generally driven by Jyotish, by the discipline of Jyotish. So it is connected, to answer your question. Okay.
I think with this, we can end this session. Thank you so much, Pankaj ji. It was a very enriching session. Thank you so much. Dhanyavad. Maybe we can end the day with the prayer. Just requesting everyone to just close their eyes and we can end the day. Oh. Om Purnamadah Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Harihi Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Harihi Om.